I'm going to put these words to you, these wonderfully florid, well-written words, Raphael, and see if you recognise them, not only in certain tone, but who may have written them. Media debates have honed in on the most readily available numbers, the poor goal-scoring return despite creating a wealth of chances, and a series of defensive blackouts by seasoned pros on the other end of the pitch. But blaming the for and against columns as the causes for the malaise is a bit like blaming a fever on a patient's high temperature. Do you know who wrote that?
It does sound familiar.
Yeah, this is from 2014-2015 in Jurgen Klopp's what turned out to be his final season at Borussia Dortmund, when I guess the bloom had come off the rose to a certain degree by dint of a really horrific spell prior to Christmas and in around the New Year as well, whereby they slumped into the relegation zone in the Bundesliga. Now, obviously, we're a long ways away from Liverpool being in real trouble here as Borussia Dortmund were in that particular season, but there have been parallels drawn, obviously enough, between the two seasons. The coincidences of selling major strikers, the Bayern Munich factor and all of that as well, and just the general lack of, I don't know, oomph that there seems to be about Liverpool so far this season. What have you made of these first three games, first of all, and the lapse there seems to have been from last term?
Well, I think the three games didn't really have that much in common. I think Liverpool did enough to win at least two of them. I think they probably did enough to draw the third, and then we'd be having a different conversation. But of course, this is a team that thrives off energy, that lives off energy. And if the energy is a little bit low, if players are having to be played who in a normal season or under normal circumstances would probably be your first choice subs rather than first choice starters, especially midfield, then the overall quality suffers. And I think then looking at the bench when United have, I think, 300 million euros or pounds worth of players on the bench, and Liverpool had mostly youngsters and centre backs, that shows you that right now they're going through a lean spell, not so much, I think, in terms of the overall picture and things are being manifestly wrong or fundamentally problematic with this team, but in terms of the numbers and players available. And I think that is the biggest problem. A Liverpool team, a Klopp team that doesn't rotate, that doesn't have options off the bench, that doesn't have that energy from the start or being injected, having injected that energy at later times during the game, that team will suffer. And I think that's what we've seen so far.
Are there many parallels, do you think, like you would have watched on that 2014-15 season for Dortmund? Are there many parallels in terms of, I know the results, or sorry, the performances are kind of three separate performances, but in terms of that lowering in energy, there seems to have been a bit of that, and I think the game against Manchester United can bear that out a little bit and underline that point, because it didn't seem like the same Liverpool that we've seen for the past 4 or 5 seasons, really.
It didn't. I think there's some similarities. It is the 7th season. Maybe that's a coincidence. I don't know, but things have been very good for a long time, and now it looks as if this could be not as good a season, but I would caution against that. I think that's way too early. And of course, the number of injuries in that season that you mentioned, 14-15, injuries were one of the huge issues for this team. They had a lot of players injured. And at the time, there was a lot of debate about Jurgen Klopp's system being perhaps a little bit too demanding, and that's why he has all these injured players. He very much argued against it. And I think if we look at the 7 years on the whole, then you would be struggling to find any correlation, I think, between Liverpool's system and their number of injuries. It seems to fluctuate with no real pattern as far as I can ascertain. But what is very different is the overall picture. I mean, this was a Dortmund team that had gone through an entire cycle of players who'd won things, and a lot of them had either moved on or come sort of towards the latter stages of their career. And that rebuilding process that was necessary wasn't really possible because Dortmund weren't in the Champions League the year when he left. Eventually, they missed the Champions League. So there was a sort of an understanding that in order to rebuild this team, to find a transition into the next team, the coach had to go, because that was the easiest button to push at the time. I think Liverpool are a million miles away from that. I think the transition has already happened to a large extent. This is already the next Liverpool. I think all the pieces are in place for another really successful team. I think going into the season, very few anticipated any major problems because there was so much depth in so many positions. It just happens that a lot of injuries have caught up with them at the very same time, and now they're very thin in some key positions. But I think it can't really be compared beyond superficial similarities to what happened at Dortmund.
On a slightly more granular level, there have been questions asked about the refreshing of the midfield, in particular at Liverpool, because they started at Old Trafford with James Milner and with Jordan Henderson, both of whom are well north of 30 now at this stage. Thiago is in around that age too, and he has become very, very injury prone. They would be two of the three main dependents for Klopp in the midfield in the past couple of years. There seems to have been, even looking at how successful it would have been the last 2-3 seasons, that the midfield was in need of a bit of a refresh, and that doesn't seem to have happened. But he can be a manager who's a bit obstinate in his ways. If he decides in his head that something doesn't need doing or something does need doing, then he will stick by that. And they have been quite adamant that they're not going to do any more business in midfield, especially this summer.
He opened the door ever so slightly after the game, I thought, where he said, I'm the wrong person to ask. We're always working on things, whether we can make them happen or not, I'm not sure. He seemed to at least to suggest to me that it's not impossible that they might do something, perhaps something a little bit more knee-jerk and more short-term than they want to do. We saw that 2 seasons ago when they had to buy centre-backs because they had this crazy wave of people injured all in the same position, and they brought in a player, I should say, on loan, who perhaps wasn't quite ready and who's since been moved on. But I think something like that is possible. I think what's important to understand, and I got this from talking to both Klopp and his number 2 many times over the course of researching the book and updates for it, is that they will often prefer not to buy someone who they think is just another body. I think from the outside looking in, we always think of transfers as improvements, as reinforcements, as adding numbers. And I think Klopp and Pete Kravitz and everyone else thinks that every transfer changes things, and they might not change things for the better. So you have to be really sure that the person that you bring in can improve the team, is the right character, ticks all the boxes. I think Liverpool were quite far advanced with 1 or 2 players in the transfer market that it didn't work out. Tchouaméni, for example, somebody who went to Real Madrid, was definitely high on Liverpool's agenda a few months ago. In the end, they couldn't make it happen. And I can easily see why they will say, well, there's not another Tchouaméni now ready to come in August. We'd rather wait, give this 1 more year, and then buy our next target, who might be Jude Bellingham, who knows. But that is generally the way that they've done things. And remember, every single year since he's come in, I think people have questioned the transfer policy. There's always been, we're missing this, we're missing that, we're missing a centre forward, we're missing another centre back. And I think the points and the results so far would suggest that more often than not, I think internally they got the, shall we say, the measure of the squad more accurately than perhaps from the outside looking in.
What would be the balance in terms of that opinion that Fenway Sports Group don't open the purse strings, balanced by Klopp doesn't want to bring in players just for the sake of it? Where does that balance lie this summer?
I think it depends a little bit on what the injury situation is with Naby Keita. I don't think they have yet a clear picture of how long he's out for. Well, that in itself, of course, is worrying. Thiago's injury record we all know about, so that is worrying. If you're going into the season with the 3 players that started on Monday night, plus Fabinho, plus Curtis Jones, I think it will be a little bit thin, especially if you play 3 midfielders all the time. And we know with the World Cup how crazy the schedule is, crazier than ever before. So I think that in itself might tempt both FSG and Jurgen Klopp to say, okay, are there any targets that we would otherwise try to sign for next summer that we can bring forward? If not, is there anyone who can do a short-term solution for us without any huge financial risk? I can see why they would at least exploit that, because at the moment it does look a little bit thin in that area.
As regards their playing style, that was brought into focus, I guess, as well over the last, well, especially after Monday night, with how Trent Alexander-Arnold was exposed, and it almost mirrors in a way his performance in the Champions League final back in May. And there's people who say, and this I saw from reading that same piece of yours from 7-8 years ago, was that at the time when Klopp was asked about it and tackled about the theory that you've been found out, his response essentially was, well, what does that say about all the managers that have faced us up until then, that they just were unable to find us out? It doesn't ring true. And that there seems to be an element of that as well, whereby there quite clearly are issues there, but I'm not sure if they're people figuring them out, or if it's people need a refresh, or if it's more like, because everything goes through the fullbacks, right? Everything goes through the wing backs at Liverpool, and they're the ones who don't necessarily get rotated when most others do in that side. Is it just a case that Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson need a couple of weeks extra off, or what is it there, do you reckon?
Well, Trent's always been under heavy duty because there isn't really a ready-made substitute for him. At least on the left-hand side, there's Tsimikas, but Joe Gomez doesn't quite offer the same going forward, and that's why it's always down to Trent. I don't think it's necessarily about the teams having suddenly woken up to the fact that Trent Alexander-Arnold is sometimes a defensively suspect. That's been the case for many years. It's just that, unfortunately, in the game against United, he switched off at a key moment, and then also Van Dijk switched off, who could have perhaps rescued the situation. So you had a combination of people just losing a bit of focus. Champions League final, I disagree. I don't think he was at fault for the mistake. By the time that ball comes in, there's not a lot you can do if you're playing offside and try to hold the line. But the wider points, it rings true. I mean, Trent has these off moments, and I think the balance here is that he offers so much going forward that Klopp says, okay, this is what you get, this is what you have to take. Also, as the right back, don't forget, at least one half, he is the guy that gets all the flack from Klopp. He's always the closest to the bench for 45 minutes. So Klopp has at least 45 minutes to always sort of coach him and shake him up almost. But at that moment in time, he was, of course, at the opposite side of the pitch. So I'm not sure that was the decisive factor, but yeah, he does sometimes lose focus and concentration a little bit, but that's nothing new.
How does Klopp go about ensuring that doesn't happen as frequently as, Manchester United managed to exploit on Monday night?
Just have to talk to the player, remind him of his responsibilities, also make sure that he has protection. Sometimes there were huge gaps in midfield. And then if you are exposed as a right back, you will lose sometimes your man, or you'll have a problem if it's 1v1. That happens to the best of them. So ideally, you stop that situation from arising in the first place by controlling the ball, as Liverpool like to do, by winning the ball further up, as they like to do. A lot of these things didn't quite work out. And of course, there's somebody then holding, carrying the can at the end, who's not necessarily the main culprit, but the guy who suffers the most from previous mistakes. And that is another fact I think we shouldn't overlook. But yeah, I mean, Trent, we saw that from England performances. We see that from his continued absence from the England starting 11 when it comes to big games, can be defensively problematic. But if the team functions as well as they did throughout last season, and let's not forget how close they came to winning absolutely everything, then I think that's a price worth paying.
Yeah, I don't think we're pressing the panic button yet and saying Klopp out or anything like that. That'd be ridiculously silly, or completely changing the bathwater as well, because again, there's so much credit in the bank for those players. But like, you can see why there's cause for concern when you see like the moments of dissension that we saw on the pitch. Like it didn't quite get to McManaman Grobbelaar levels, but when you see the finger pointing and arguments back and forth between James Milner and Virgil van Dijk, for instance, like from what has been noted as being a really unified and really close dressing room, when that kind of stuff starts manifesting on the pitch, people are entitled to ask questions about, is this squad really where it needs to be at the moment?
It's true, but I think the answer from Klopp would be, and maybe from some of the players, that you'd rather see that than just everyone being quiet and just happy to have conceded a goal and you kick off again. I think there needs to be some kind of inquest when at least two players completely switched off for what proved to be a crucial goal, because we know that United wanted to play on the break. United had 30% or less than 30% of the ball. You go 1-0 down against a team like that, then it becomes really, really difficult. So there was just no excuse really by the way that they conceded the goal. And Milner, part of the reason why Klopp loves him, part of the reason why he's such an important figure behind the scene, will not go quietly into the night. And he will point fingers and even take on Van Dijk, who probably a lot of players, that's just my sense, my opinion, my feeling, would probably hesitate from addressing or confronting face to face on the pitch. But Milner is so experienced and so sure in himself that he will do it. And I think this was not a question of people having a sort of a falling out or an altercation between personalities. This was about somebody not doing their job and being reminded what needs to be done. And I think Klopp would probably welcome that.
Yeah, going forward in terms of the team, a lot has been made obviously enough of Sadio Mane heading off to Bayern Munich, and he pointed out the player wanted a different challenge. Klopp was fairly open to that as well, and possibly felt that his front three as it is on the pitch probably needed a bit of a refresh. But there's no doubting that lack of X factor that he brought to the side is a massive loss to them this season as well.
I think it's a massive loss when Diogo Jota is not on the pitch. I think when Jota is there, you have all the energy, you have everything that Mane does in a slightly different way. But I would say it's as close as a one-to-one as you get in terms of the energy, in terms of the application. Jota might not always have a great game, but like Mane, he will never just go missing. He always, every time I've seen him, he is there. He does things, he makes things awkward, and that sheer energy is infectious and helps everyone else. And I think without him and without Núñez, again, it's not quite the same. They looked a little bit leggy. They looked a little bit isolated, but I would say the bigger issue was the midfield behind them. I mean, how many times did we see, for example, Mohamed Salah touching the ball and somebody being close to him? There seemed to be these huge gaps. The game was very, very stretched, and then it becomes very, very difficult. Even though United gave them a lot of possession, Liverpool didn't really find a lot of rhythm with the ball to create these good moments, and I think a lot of it was down to the midfield being quite negative, passing sideways where they perhaps could have been a bit more incisive, and all these things combined. So again, I think if you cast your mind back to, let's say, a month ago or 2 months ago, and you saw how well these front five performed, and then you add Núñez, and then you take away Mane, and you still have a front five which looks pretty good and pretty tasty, I don't think there's necessarily much room to suggest that Mane now is a huge problem that changes completely the dynamic of this team. But again, injuries, 2 out of these 5 being out is probably too many, especially now that you have Firmino being a little bit out of shape, I would say. And then all of a sudden it looks not quite as compelling as it did last season.
Does Klopp tend to, in a perverse way, kind of enjoy these moments where the team aren't performing to their optimum and he has something to work with, or is it just going to wreck his head between game to game and trying to get it right? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if you know that you've a horrible job ahead of you, but there's an element of loving that it's completed and getting to the bottom of it, there's a satisfaction there, I guess.
I think he absolutely hates it.
Okay.
He hates it. He compared it to me to having to go into the rain. You don't want to do it, but you have to do it anyway. And he's somebody who uses every moment he has spare to go and sit in the sun in Spain or somewhere else. So he does not enjoy it, I'm sure. He wants the team to function. He wants the things to be right. He wants to tweak little things at half time, a little bit of positioning, a little bit of a change of rhythm, change of direction, and then it clicks even better. But to have to solve so many problems at the moment, I don't think he enjoys it at all. It's not as bad, I think, as it was during that season when all the injuries really wrecked their season and Liverpool struggled to make the Champions League. Let's not forget. Yeah. I don't think we're at that stage yet. But he is clearly frustrated with the amount of injuries and the knock-on effects it has on his team, where everyone seems a little bit out of rhythm, out of energy, with no chance to refresh from the bench. I think that is the biggest issue at the moment.
In a weird way, he, in that 2014-15 season, kept pointing towards the fact that, when we get further into the season, it's going to be okay. And to a degree, like finishing 7th that season from the points that they were at proves that when things do click, even after a very difficult spell, they can go, and he can be behind a pretty remarkable run. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility, even with the World Cup being lumped into the middle of the season, that they can recover from this. And granted, it is still, just 2 draws and a defeat from 3 games, but they can still recover from this and end up with a pretty decent season behind them.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that this can still be a very good season, but the amount of games that you have before November make it even more important, I think, to bring these players back, because basically you will, every time these players are out, it hurts more because of the amount of games that they'll miss. I mean, Thiago now being out hurts you a lot more than in a normal season, because you'll have 3 Champions League games, all packed into a couple of weeks and all these things. And it makes everything a lot more difficult than it otherwise would do. The interesting thing with that 14-15 season was that while everybody said, well, the system is finished and this team is finished and they are just in desperate need of a change, and even the club felt that eventually, the numbers actually suggested that they got incredibly unlucky and were still by far the second best team in the Bundesliga, and that all that happened between the first half of the season, where they finished 17th, and the second, when they finished 7th, was that the luck just switched again, and they basically got the results that the performances warranted.
There was a lot of 1-goal defeats in that run as well, if I remember right.
Absolutely. The interesting thing is, though, when you mention that to Klopp and his assistant, they almost don't want to believe in luck, and they say, well, no, we had to change this and we had to change that. So they're kind of convinced that they used the winter break to sort things out. But later on, it became quite clear, looking at the numbers. At the time, expected goals wasn't a readily available system, but there were people using it, and some of them actually talked to Klopp. And then Klopp found, also from the Liverpool analysts, when he moved to Liverpool in October, that they showed him the numbers and suggested that they just had a horrific season in terms of just getting really, really unlucky, and they should have never been the 17th best team or the second worst team in the Bundesliga in that first half season.
So they just need luck to turn their way between now and Christmas, I guess. All right, Raphael Honigstein, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we fully expect for Jurgen Klopp to get the nose up on this season for Liverpool. But for the meantime, thank you.